What's the scariest true story you've heard or told? There have been several confirmed cases in a few different countries of people living in other people's houses unbeknownst to them. I believe one case went on for a couple of years. The intruder would wait until the homeowner would go to work and then sneak out to steal small amounts of food as to not be noticed. Well, eventually the homeowner did notice and couldn't figure out where his food was going, so he set up a hidden camera to record it. I can only imagine how scary it would have been to come home from work one night and sit down to watch the video, skipping through hours of stillness to suddenly come across a person crawling out of your attic, and then the slow realization that that person is still in your house at that moment, and then the retroactive fear of thinking back to all the times you laid awake at night and heard a noise which you just dismissed as coming from the pipes or the old wooden beams, but actually it was a person just above you. It gives me the heebie-jeebies every time I think about it. I have actually heard quite a few stories of this, and if you go search that kind of thing on YouTube, you'll probably find actual footage of this. I met a guy who had been traveling Australia with a couple of friends, hitchhiking around, as many of us had done. One of his friends told him they were near his distant uncle's house, whom he'd never met before. He got a phone number from a family member, and as they had hoped, the uncle offered them a place to stay. He picked them up in town and drove them out to his rural property, way out in the bush. They said he seemed like a pretty normal guy, friendly and cheery. When it was time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle took them to a closet that was totally full of sleeping bags and bedrolls. They didn't think much of it at the time and grabbed a kit and set up on the living room floor. They stayed a couple of days and nothing out of the ordinary happened. And afterwards, the uncle drove them to the bus station and they continued on their way. About a year later, that man was arrested and charged with several counts of murder. He was the man who was picking up young hitchhiking backpackers and slaughtering them. The guy who told me the story was 100% certain he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of the victims. Well, I guess he got the family benefits of not being murdered this time. One day as a kid, I was exploring the forest near our house with my cousin. The forest was on a hill, but there were several craters there because of bombs that were dropped there during World Wars. One day we saw a backpack at the bottom of one. We tried to climb down, but it was kind of steep and slippery, so we didn't want to risk falling. We planned on returning later with a rope, and went home. The next day news story was that there was a backpack found with the remains of a girl in that forest. A guy walking his dog found it, after the dog wouldn't stop barking and going crazy at the edge of the crater, while staring at the backpack. We stopped exploring the forests after. Well, I don't know that necessarily means that the forest is a dangerous place to be. It seems more like it's just an easy place for people to dispose of evidence. I lived with 3 other girls sophomore year of college. All 3 took off early for spring break, leaving me alone in the house. The first night alone, I heard someone bang on my front door at 2 a.m. Then I hear more knocks at my back door. A man yells, "Boulder Police, open the door!" When I didn't, I heard body slams against both doors. Soon I hear, "Little girl, open the door, we know you're alone." At this point, I'm so scared I keep accidentally dialing 611 instead of 911. When I eventually do get the police, cars roll up, thankfully, just minutes later. Officers have 4 boys from our school hockey team face down on the grass. I had to file restraining orders against them and the kicker. One lived across the street from me, and we'd never spoken a single word before then. I mean, it's great that they didn't break in, but stories like this are what make people often really want to go buy a gun. When I worked in healthcare, I had a patient who got a sinus infection. He stopped taking his antibiotics after a few days because he felt better. His sinus infection came back with a vengeance. When he got in the emergency department, he was presented with stroke symptoms. The infection had spread to his cranial cavity. There was so much pus that it had twisted his brain. No one thought he would survive the surgery. The family was advised to expect the worst, but amazingly he actually survived. He ended up needing 3 more surgeries to wash out and spent almost 2 months in the hospital. Take your full dose of antibiotics, people. You know, I always think it's so weird when people have some sort of what seems like a minor illness. You know, something that you wouldn't really expect to be so bad, but then it just keeps growing and growing. The Reina Maraquin story. A young lady had an affair with her boss in the 1960s and got pregnant. After threatening to tell her boss's wife, she was killed by her boss, who then put her body in an industrial barrel. He hid the barrel in his house for years, and none of the various owners opened it, due to the weight. Finally, one guy decided to dispose of it in the 90s, and when he opened it, he saw it contained something. An investigation traced the barrel and girl back to the man, who then killed himself before police could come arrest him after confirming he was the father of the unborn baby via DNA. The lady's mother was in her late 80s when she was told her missing daughter was finally found. She claims that she had been having dreams about her daughter being inside a metal container for years after she had gone missing. Man, I'm honestly surprised that they can trace so much from a body that's been dead for 30 years. I was in class in 10th grade, and the teacher was asking everyone how their weekend was. The quietest girl in the class spoke, and while breaking down in tears, she said that she was on a trip in the mountains with her mom. They made a stop for some reason, and she looked over the cliff and saw an overturned vehicle with a dead family scattered about. I mean, I've talked a lot about how hiking seems so dangerous, how you could be one step from falling off a cliff, but I guess it could be just as bad in a car, too. One of my friends was drugged by a nice-seeming girl at a bar that tried to sex traffic her. The girl got her an Uber to an address she didn't know under the guise of, "Get my drunk friend home." But she woke up on the way and told the driver she didn't know where they were going. They called the cops. Apparently that wasn't the first time that week they'd heard the same story, and they recognized the address as the one they were already tracking. If she hadn't woken up on the way, she might have been trafficked by now. Apparently they use younger, safe-seeming girls to do the collecting a lot of the time. Yeah, I guess it doesn't really matter what somebody looks like, there could be evil hiding in anybody. I'm not sure I remember all the details correctly, but a guy was cleaning a giant cooking tank at a tuna factory. It was so big that he had to climb all the way in. Someone else didn't check, and protocol was broken along the way somewhere. The second guy locked the barrel and turned it on, cooking the guy inside alive. That seems kinda strange, because if the guy is inside of it cleaning it, then it's gotta be empty, right? So why would somebody just come along and decide to turn it on if there's nothing inside to cook? My mother never taught me to swim because when she was a teenager, she saw a friend get sucked into a whirlpool at the bottom of a drainage lake that is the deepest body of water within a few hundred miles of us. They didn't find his body for days. I would say it's probably still okay to swim, just don't do it in a drainage lake. I was a director of my college's student government. There was this dude who was always willing to take on projects, so I gave him lots of stuff. I remember thinking he was very charismatic and well-dressed, and when he told me he owned a startup clothing company, I bought some stuff from his website. It was typical for student government kids to end up at the same parties, and I ran into him several times outside of committee. I was studying abroad my senior year, and I was here on Reddit. I saw an article with the guy's face on it. Turns out he raped 12 girls at my university. It was apparently well known, but his father was a wealthy professor. It kept getting swept under the rug. Apparently he had been using extracurriculars like the student government to keep coming back to campus after he had been removed from his classes. I mean, how much corruption does it take for somebody to just get away with that 12 times? The lake bottom murders are very scary. Like, there are 4 teens who go on a camping trip to Finland. The next morning, 3 of the teens are found murdered, and one of them is almost dead and severely injured, but survived. No one knows who the murderer is today. 44 years later, the 4th teen, Nils, who survived, was accused of murdering them and gets sent to prison. But then he was released a year later, because there was a little DNA evidence to prove this, and no good evidence to prove that he murdered them at all. However, there is circumstantial evidence such as he allegedly fought his one friend due to an argument and was drunk. Some say this could have ended in accidental and/or intentional murder. However, I personally highly doubt that Nils is guilty. I couldn't find much information on who Nils thought the murderer was, so my thoughts are, 1, it's too traumatic for him to remember, or 2, he didn't recognize the person. Some other key suspects include the manager of the camp, who was known for being quite hostile, an ice cream vendor who admitted to the crime on his deathbed, and a man who lived only a short distance from the camp who claimed to be in Germany during that time. However, there is much doubt for this claim. There was a sketch released of the alleged murderer, who seemed to be an unsettling picture of an older man, and you could find a photo of the man, who looked like the guy in the sketch, attending a police speech. You know, it's kind of strange that when you hear stories about this in real life, they're like really dark and depressing, yet you could have an identical story put into like a murder mystery type theme, and then suddenly it's all fun and playful. When I was young, I saw a documentary about a guy who got flesh-eating bacteria in his nasal cavity. It ate his face, and he's still alive. Eventually they removed the bacteria by removing the eaten parts of the face. He got a prosthetic face, which back in those days was basically a plastic Halloween mask that tried to look human. At the end of the documentary, he took the mask off. His face from his forehead down to his mouth was just a hole. Oh man, I've seen stuff like that, it just seems so horrible. I can understand why people don't even want to go on living like that. I had an associate that was a fireman. He had to go find the head of his brother-in-law after a car accident. Then he had to console his sister when she heard. Tough bloke. Can you imagine that being your day? Yeah, it turns out being a firefighter is a whole lot more than just spraying water on some flames. I'm a crime writer, and once interviewed a woman who told me an unrelated horror story about something that happened to her as a girl. When she was like 10, she had trouble sleeping, and imagined the boogeyman was living in her closet, staring at her during the night. Every night she would come down and tell her parents, and every night her father would tell her that the boogeyman didn't exist, and she would go back to bed. Well, this happened for several nights, and the father got tired of it, so that night he walked her back to her bedroom, turned the light on, and said, "I'll show you there's no boogeyman," and went to open the closet door, but something on the other side held it shut. He sent his daughter out of the room and forced the door open to find that a man was inside. He'd been sneaking into their house every night to stand in the girl's closet and watch her, and maybe more. He beat the ever-loving crap out of the man, and the man went to prison. When I interviewed this woman, I looked him up online. He'd recently gotten out on parole and had skipped out on his weekly checks. There was a warrant out for his arrest and nobody knew where he was anymore. Well, he's shown where he likes to hide, so there's probably a lot of closets he gotta check. But I mean, something like that seems so much more difficult than the people that are like hiding away in somebody's attic. Because in that case, you know, you're always in hiding and you can tell when they're not home, so you can just always creep in and out. But imagine breaking into a house and slipping out every night without being noticed. When I was a little girl, 9 years old or thereabouts, I was playing at the school down the street from my house. It was the middle of summer, and myself and a girlfriend were hanging around and watching the boys playing street hockey. One of the boys called my name and said a man in the parking lot was looking for me. The parking lot was mostly obscured by the building, but I could see an old 70s style van that hadn't been there earlier. I was walking over to the van when the mother of one of the other kids showed up looking for her son and asked me what I was doing. When I told her someone in the van was looking for me, she took my hand and started to walk with me, and the van pulled out and sped away. My friend's mom walked me home, and I wasn't allowed out of my yard without my parents for the rest of the summer. I was so upset and didn't understand why I was being punished. It was only years later that I understood that I was likely being targeted by some opportunistic scumbag for who knows what. Thanks, Mrs. Gibson, wherever you are. Man, I feel like this video is just turning into a combination of every type of PSA. My mom was stalked by a guy in her chemistry class. This was back in the late 70s, during her first semester at college. They were lab partners, and my mom thought he seemed cute and nice, and was too shy at the time to ask him out. But she said if he'd asked her out, she would have went. They were friendly with each other in class, but their paths didn't cross outside of that, since they were in different majors. As the semesters wore on, however, she noticed he was often waiting for her outside of her other classes. The library, the student union, out in front where her dad picked her up and dropped her off. This continued into the spring semester. Puzzled, but not yet alarmed, she asked him how he always seemed to know where she was. He proudly said, "Oh, I asked the registrar's office for a copy of your schedule." My mom went to complain to the secretary who gave out her schedule, and the secretary blew it off because, "You guys are dating." Luckily, my mom had already arranged to transfer to a different school for sophomore year, and spent the remaining time left avoiding him. She never saw him after that, but it wasn't over. Flash forward to grad school, Mom was at work and Grandma gets a knock on the door. Since the man at the door was in a naval uniform and my grandmother was a Navy nurse, she let the man in because he looked rather sad. He starts off by saying how sorry he is for my mother's loss, which completely mystified Grandma. "Well, ma'am, I just got back from overseas and I found out my friend recently killed himself. He spoke so highly of his fiancée, your daughter, and I wanted to meet her." My grandmother told him her daughter didn't even have a boyfriend at the moment, let alone a fiancé. It doesn't take too long to establish the man's deceased friend in question was in fact Mom's stalker. The naval lieutenant was pretty upset, and my grandmother even more so. She made him leave before Mom got home. The weird thing about the stalker's death is that it was ruled a suicide, but he hanged himself from a very high up tree branch you'd need to get a ladder to get to, and his hands were tied behind his back. From what my mother later learned, he had a tendency to snoop and generally stick his nose in places they didn't belong besides the obvious stalking thing, and this didn't win him too many friends. So it's anyone guess who he might have pissed off. My mom always concludes this story kind of nonchalantly like, yeah, back in those days, they didn't even really know much about stalking. They've gotten a little better in terms of awareness now. It gives me the creeps to think what would have happened if he escalated his attempts to follow her after she left that school. You know, whenever I hear a story about a guy who stalks a girl who has no interest in him, sometimes I have to wonder, like, what would it be like if they just ended up together? If she did have interest and then they just got together, would it just be like a normal relationship and that dark side would have never come out of him? But then it makes me also think, what if there are lots of people out there who are in regular relationships, and had that not gone so well, then that person would be completely mentally unstable and be stalking them? Basically what I'm trying to say is the person who's stalking just naturally crazy? Or was it the situation that he was put in that drove him to be crazy? So a few years ago, I was living in a big city. I didn't know anyone. A guy I was seeing came from abroad to visit me. At the end of his trip, I accompanied him to his train home. After that, I went back into the metro to go home. It was about 2 p.m., very bright and sunny outside. I sat down on a branch near a man. We made eye contact and I said hello. He said hello back. I felt like something was off but tried to ignore it. The metro car came and we both got inside. It was crowded. I took a seat. He took one of the only available ones, which was right across from me. I started thinking I was overreacting since he started talking to a man near me. Seemed like they knew each other. His friend got off after a few stops, but he stayed. Once I saw my own stop approaching to change lines, I got up. He got up too and was right behind me. I could see his reflection in the metro car window, and he was very slowly looking at my legs up and down. I started to feel very uneasy. The doors open, we get off. I start walking quickly to the end of the platform, then realize he might be following me. There were several entrances and exits around, so I suddenly changed direction to go to another exit. He changed course as well. Then I turned around again. He followed. I did this a few times, and he changed his path to match mine each time. Eventually I knew I had to leave somehow, so he wouldn't catch up, so I went to the exit I needed to take to change lines and go home. Unfortunately, the passageway to the next line was flooded with people, so I was slowed down. He caught up with me and started crowding me in, getting closer and closer to me. I was backed up against a wall at this point, him just smiling brightly at me. "Hello, how are you?" he asked me, still inching towards me. I was terrified at this point. No one stopped to even glance at us, so I knew unless I did something myself, I wasn't getting away from him. I glanced to the right and saw a staircase downwards. Without warning, I sprinted away to the stairs. He was very caught off guard, and it took him 2 or 3 seconds to start following me. I flew down the stairs and straight into a metro car. I turned around to see if he was close behind. He was sprinting down the stairs as well. Thankfully, the doors closed before he could get to the bottom and we pulled away. Surprisingly, I had gotten onto the right metro line and direction to go home. Not that it mattered much to me at the time. That incident, and several others of men following me home or in the street, make me paranoid when I walk outside alone. See, it's not actually very often that being in good shape will come in handy in your life, but in the off chance that you need to run for your life, it's good if you have at least some cardio. There was a man who got out of his car after it broke down on the highway and attempted to walk across the highway to the other side late at night. He was hit by a car, and his body was driven over so many times that by the time the sun came up, his body parts were scattered across 300 meters of highway. Oh, well then, I hope you guys knew what you were getting into when you decided to watch this video. This happened to a girl I know. She came back home with her Tinder date. They were both drunk and high a little. She went in to change, and when she came back to her bedroom, her date bent down to remove his shoes. As he got back up, he violently dragged her against her will. She struggled and he covered her mouth. Took her all the way outside of her place, out of the apartment complex, with a strong hold. Then finally he let her go, and she asked what the heck was wrong with him. He told her that a man was hiding under her bed. Well, that was an interesting twist, though I don't know why he would have to drag her so far out of her own place to tell her that. There's that story about a woman who was found pushing her baby had been dead on a swing for 2 days. The baby died from hypothermia and dehydration. She was found not criminally negligent due to schizophrenia. I mean, this is a very simplified version of the story, but yeah, the schizophrenic woman was just pushing her kid on the swing for just days straight. I mean, who knows what was going on in her head, but then, yeah, the baby dies, and then she just keeps going for a few more days. I don't know if this will seem that scary, but one time when I was about 16, I was at a laundromat with a friend in her neighborhood. I wasn't as familiar with the neighborhood. I was just there to hang out with her. We start walking inside, and there's this man standing outside his car, seemingly looking for something. He was a bit older. My friend walked right past them without giving them a single glance, but he caught me looking and asked, "Will you come help me find my phone? I dropped it down here somewhere and I can't find it." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I looked into the car and noticed a second man in the car staring dead at me. I'll never forget the way he looked at me. I immediately snapped my head away and followed my friend inside. When we got inside, she told me that those men were known traffickers, and that was one of their ploys. I was shaken up because if I had been a little younger and a little dumber, I don't know if I would have seen the second man in the car. I think I might have helped the old man. See, why can't people just call up the police when there are known human traffickers right there? When I was about 5, I woke up to my house surrounded by loud voices and bright white lights. A group of robbers broke into our house after some kind of heist and were using us as hostages with rifles. The police had our house surrounded. My parents, grandparents, and I didn't really speak English back then, so my 12-year-old sister had to translate the demands to the police and instructions to us. My grandma told me to go back to sleep, which I somehow easily did. Well, that's all the scary stories for today. Hope you guys are looking forward to Halloween. I should be able to have a few more scary story weekends leading up to Halloween. But that's all for tonight.